Hello again, everyone.
Hello.
Happy day of translation. In this panel, advocating for literary translation, to borrow from the Serbian conceptual and performance artist Marina Abramović, the translators are present. 4 of today's leading literary translators discuss the most pressing issues in the field, along with their efforts to make the art of translation visible. Anton is the first Korean translator to have won PEN translation grants transatlantically. He was double longlisted and shortlisted for the 2022 Booker Prize and won the Wynne Prize for his contribution to Korean arts and culture. He lives in Seoul and Songdo. Born in Andhra Pradesh, India, Madhu Kaza is a writer, translator, artist, and educator based in New York City. She's a translator of contemporary Telugu women writers, including Volga and Vimala. She recently guest edited a special feature for Gulf Coast on writing from less translated languages, and she served as a 2021 juror for the National Book Award in Translated Literature. She's the editor of Kitchen Table Translation, which is wonderful, a volume that explores connections between translation and migration, and her work has appeared in the Yale Review, Gulf Coast, Los Angeles Review of Books, Guernica, Two Lines, Waxwing, Chimurenga, and more. She works as assistant dean of the Bard microcolleges for the Bard Prison Initiative and also teaches in the MFA writing program at Columbia University. Julia Sanches is the winner of the 2022 PEN Translation Prize for her translation of Mariana Oliver's Migratory Birds. Sanches is a translator of Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan. She's translated works by Susana Moreira Marques, Dolores Reyes, Daniel Galera, and Eva Baltazar, among others. Her shorter translations have appeared in various magazines and periodicals, including Words Without Borders, Granta, Tin House, and Guernica. A founding member of Cedilla & Co., she sits on the Council of the Authors Guild. Frank Wynne, an Irish literary translator, writer, and editor, has earned the Impact Dublin Literary Award and the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. He has twice been awarded both the Scott Moncrieff Prize and the Premio Via Inclán. His translation of The Art of Losing by Alice Zeitner won the 2022 Dublin Literary Award. He has edited 2 major anthologies, Found in Translation, 100 of the Finest Short Stories Ever Translated, and Queer, LGBT Writing from Ancient Times to Yesterday. In 2022, he was chair of the jury for the International Booker Prize. Please welcome Anton, Madhu, Julia, and Frank.
I don't know which way to face, you or everyone who's slowly digesting their lunches. I was going to put you on the spot and make you introduce yourselves, but since Michael already did a brilliant job of that, I'm going to dive right into the conversation with possibly an uncomfortable question, which is, why do you think that you were approached to speak about advocating for literary translation? And if you want to talk about why you agreed, apart from the perks of being wined and dined by the Center for the Art of the Translation and having an opportunity to swan around some museums. Why us for? I'm gonna start with you because you're right in my line of sight, Anton.
Oh. I actually have no idea. So I think one of the first panels I did was something about advocacy in translation. And I confessed that one of my other panelists had sprung her author out of jail. And I'm like, wow, I've never done anything like that. I don't know why I'm glad I'm here. But one of the points that we made in that panel, for example, was that translation itself is advocacy. And it can only be advocacy. Like, even if you don't really approach it from like a political, whatever people mean by that angle, it can only be that you are advocating for someone. And I felt, yeah, there is an element of that. I also feel like in my case, because I don't know, I live on Twitter, so I'm very visible online. I'm always like flogging my authors, not literally. I'm flogging them onto the readership. That I think people have this idea that I'm very kind of advocating for their visibility, and that's also true because one of the things that we're told as translators is that we should try to expand the readership of our authors in the target language, and part of that, and your authors don't always speak English, like Ora Chung, one of my authors, she speaks great English because she studied, here in America. But for the most part, my writers they don't speak English, so their only access, their surest access is the translator. And of course, we're always being told that when we're selling and submitting our authors' works, the Korean publisher, in my case, the Korean publisher can't do it because they understand the work very well, but they can't quite articulate why this book is important or contextualize it within in my case, the American and British tradition. And the agents on the other side, when they represent Korean authors, in the very few cases that they do represent Korean authors, they can't read the book in Korean. And so it's very difficult for them to make a convincing argument that the book is absolutely essential. And they can't give a feel of what it means to read the book and be moved by the book. And of course the author doesn't speak English in this case. So the only person that kind of is in the middle of these two Venn diagrams, the people who can understand the book and really feel it at a very visceral level, and the people who are articulate in English enough in order to express this visceral reaction to the book, is the translator in between. And so the translator ends up having to be the advocate in a lot of times, not just as the translator translating the book, but as the person who has to flog the book. The translator ends up being the person to flog the book. And this, of course, has many, many problematic dimensions because we don't really get paid to do that part, but that part takes up a lot of our resources and a lot of time. And yeah. So I think, but I've always been kind of willing to do it, at least in the beginning of my career, because I felt very supported. And I'm in a somewhat better position than maybe some of my peers because, now my husband has a job. So it's, and he has for the past few years, because he was in grad school and I was supporting him through grad school. And when you're a translator supporting a spouse, it gets kind of But then now I can make other choices. So I feel like, I can make these choices now to do it. But then if I do it and I become so visible, and then everyone goes Anton Her is doing it, why can't you do it? I don't want that to be the effect of what I'm doing. And when people see me on Twitter, I have students and they're like, oh, we haven't joined Twitter. And I'm like, I want to tell them, don't join Twitter. It ruins your brain. It literally ruins your brain. And so many writers have kind of since joining Twitter, they kind of you could see their brains rotting. So I want to tell my students to not do it, but at the same time, I'm obviously doing it. So yeah, it gets into that kind of dicey situation. But yeah, back to you, Julia.
All right, well, so translation in itself is already advocacy, in part because of our profession, the way our profession is structured, but also, and because of the publishing ecosystem in the English language, forces you to be in the position of advocating.
Why didn't I just say that?
I'm here to summarize. I'm really bad at summarizing. What about you, Frank? You were chairing the International Booker, the Booker International. It keeps changing. International Booker. And started advocating, I believe, for... This all came after Jennifer Croft did names and you said royalties. I feel like that was...
Yeah, I mean, it's all much more complicated than that, but
yes.
nobody wants a complicated narrative. So originally, when I was asked, so I mean, to answer why I'm here, there's a wonderful movie called Network, Sidney Lumet's movie, in which Howard Beale, Peter Finch, has God speak to him. And he says, but why me? Why me, Lord? And I go, because you're on television, dummy. So I'm here because I was on the Booker jury, dummy. And that allowed me to say things. So one of the things that I found quite surprising, given that the International Booker has existed for some time in one form or another, I mean, the current form is a conflation with the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. I would sort of assumed that the Booker Foundation would have a bare bones understanding of how translation works in publishing terms. This is not true. They have no idea what translators earn on average, which publishers pay well, which publishers retain copyright, which publishers, no, there's no reason why they should, but because these are conversations that we tend to only have amongst ourselves, not very loudly in case somebody decides never to offer us work again. I had said that I wanted to use my tenure as the first translator to chair the jury to be able to say some stuff. And they went, oh, well, that's great. I mean, Jennifer said stuff about covers, what do you want to say? What I want to say is, it's complicated. Mm-hmm. I don't need my name on a cover if it means you're going to pay me half what you would have paid me otherwise. I don't want you, under no circumstances am I surrendering my copyright. I don't care how much you pay me, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things feed into all sorts of other things. But there's then an entirely separate thing to do with advocacy, not for translators, but for translation itself, which is looking at, the landscape of translated fiction in the UK and to an extent in the US, though I know less about that, has improved enormously in the 20 years I've been a translator. There are an awful lot more independent presses. There's more being published in translation. Translators have, through the good offices of Danny Hahn and Sean Whiteside and Maureen Freely and all the people at Alta and so on and so forth, got a much better sense, both in terms of their recognition and so on and so forth. But we've also looked at all of the great post-war British imprints, almost all of them founded by immigrants, almost all of them founded by Jewish refugees, which focused on literature and translation. Andre Deutsch and John Calder and Victor Gollancz and George Weidenfeld and whatever, and William Heinemann, who had whole lists dedicated to translation. And they were hugely successful, and then they were absorbed into the blob that we call the Five, which may be four soon, we don't know. And their interest in and focus on translation died, in part because there has been a shift away from publishing authors to publishing titles. The wonderful Hilary Mantel, who died earlier this week, when Wolf Hall was being published, Hilary was so unsuccessful at that time that her publisher could not afford to organize a launch party for her. So there was a small, quiet dinner of her copy editor, her, and two other people. You can be reasonably sure there was never any funds lacking for, but her publisher had stuck with her through thick and thin, through books that sold moderately well, not terribly well. That's how you publish authors, and with them you publish translators. You do not, I remember many, many years ago when I was more or less starting out at some party talking to an editor I did not know. So, oh, what do you do? I translate. Oh, what do you translate? I mostly translate. Yeah, we did a novel in translation work once. It didn't work. And that's it, suddenly, and this is part and parcel of the let's lump all translated fiction together as though, this is a thing. And these are not radically different cultures with radically different, things going on within them. But therefore it all tends to be in opposition to Anglophone hegemony, which is, really? Do we really need to learn about the world? As I said earlier with Blake Morrison, I could have read about this and Salman Rushdie could have told me this in English.
Well, thank you for that. I guess this is some more of, problems within the ecosystem that lead us to have publishing ecosystem that lead us to have to advocate. But when we were walking here, and I was like, oh, this panel is going to be about so many practical things, as opposed to the previous panel that was so beautiful and conceptual. And you, Madhu, said that wasn't your approach, or that's not what you had to bring. And I'd love to hear more about what brought you to this panel.
So the question of why I think I was invited to the panel. I love that question because it's not, I kind of don't care why I was invited. And I say that not about this event, because this is a beautiful event. I think about translation all the time, even when I'm not translating, and in my own writing, when I'm looking at art. It's just a lens through which I think about the world as someone who's an immigrant and who lives between multiple languages. But the thing about not caring is that there's the thinking about the curatorial decisions or the programming decisions or why you're asked to do a particular thing. It can get very flat very quickly because sometimes there's not always a lot of imagination there. And I think, so one answer could be that I edited a book that had to do with really advocating for more people who are part of diasporas and immigrants and people of color, to be to encourage them to be doing more translation, trying to open space for that. Advocacy is part of my work for sure, so I'm not saying I'm illegitimately here, but I actually like sometimes being on panels when I don't necessarily know why I'm there. Or like the example, I actually was saying this to Julia at lunch, that I once attended a panel. It was a part of like a Pen World Voices panel, and the whole panel was about writers who use pseudonyms, and there were like 5 wonderful panelists. Each went along and talked about like what writing under a pen name gave them, freedom, space, whatever it was. And the last speaker on the panel was Randa Jarar, and she started off by saying, well, I don't use a pen name. My name is Randa Jarar, and I write as Randa Jarar. And it's kind of brilliant because the whole panel was about writers who use pseudonyms, right? And it's like just this like one thing does not fit here. And it was wonderful. And it was brilliant. And I always am thinking about like that little, like the yellow dot in the field of like white dots or whatever. And I say that also because I think that my job is not to think about what do they want from me, what do they expect from me, but to think like, do I have something I want to say? And who do I want to be in conversation with? And I think for me, in terms of the practical, yes, I feel like there are many parts of my life where I feel like there's a very practical like advocacy where I've mentored emerging translators, I edit translations, like there's this work that I'm very invested in. But I also think that my own so sometimes I wonder why I'm invited, because I'm not the most active translator. But that itself, there's like a politics about that too, because I know a number of languages, but the language that I am most interested in translating from is my first language, which is Telugu, which is a South Indian, non-Indo-European language. It's not an obscure minor language. It's spoken by between 80 and 100 million people in the world. It's one of the top 15 languages in the world. It's a literary language with a literary tradition. It also randomly is right now the fastest growing language in the US because of immigration patterns. And yet there is like no translation published in the US from my language. And it's very impossible. It's just impossible to get that work published. And if there is work that might be published, it's like there's a kind of like fitting into this very tiny keyhole of cultural expectation. And it's something that I'm actually not that interested in. And so I think that like I just feel like it's a really rich and interesting game. Like what wants to belong, what wants to resist belonging, on what terms. Maybe like translation can happen in places that are not canonical, like not the big presses. I'm interested in like all the different like threads around how like work circulates. And I think that my feeling is my work is to really like I feel very, so I can, like, I enjoy sometimes being like the cranky person who says, well, what about XYZ? You know, but I also, like, I love literature, you know, and I love, you know, and I love the world of translation. And I feel like, you know, for me, it's less about what, like I feel like sometimes for me, it's like less about the frame of like what I'm being asked to do or how I'm asked to represent myself or a culture or a language than like what are some like knots that we can kind of get into.
Thank you for that. I'm going to briefly speak for myself. I assumed that it was because of my work with the Authors Guild and my banging on about contracts and rights in many other panels. But I guess I wanted to try to be a bit more expansive about the idea of advocacy because someone, Alex Zucker, who most of you might know, who translates from Czech and is also very involved with the Authors Guild behind the scenes, has always sort of hammered into me the distinction between advocating for literary translation and advocating for literary translators as being related, but not entirely the same at all. The other thing I learned from him was that it's different to publish a book and print a book. And those two live together in my mind.
If I can just give you a word, my late lamented good friend David Miller, who was my agent, made the distinction between publishing a book and privishing a book.
Very good.
Privishing a book is, you've got it, you print it, you don't bother trying to find anyone to read it.
Yep. And so when I wrote to you all earlier this week, I just kept thinking that there are so many different ways that we can go. And as I was riding up on the train, I was talking to my partner about this, and he was like, you're on a panel that wouldn't exist if things were okay. We're like on a panel that we hope will eventually become obsolete, maybe because of the conversations we're having, but probably because of other things that branch off from these conversations. And I guess I'd like to maybe start with some more of the advocating for literary translation. The fact that we have to do it at all is kind of baffling to me, but it's, you know, we're translating into English, whether we like to or not. And another thought I had was that there's also advocating for the literatures of the places that you translate from, which has always sat a little bit uncomfortable with me in terms of like the advocating for the presence of more Brazilian literature in the United States. And I wonder, yeah, if you have any thoughts on, you know, you talk a lot about, you Anton ask a lot about, you know, who's reviewing Korean literature. And is that a sort of place that you feel comfortable sort of advocating for national literature to have more of a presence in another publishing space, or, yeah, I don't know if that's a question.
Oh, no. It's a very important question because it's one that I constantly think about. Like, sometimes there's this very famous critic, I won't name, but you might be able to guess. And it's usually a he. Like wrote this review about this Korean book, and then in the review he said he has never read a Korean book before, and this is the only Korean book and then he wrote another review where he said, oh, I've only read one Korean book in my life, and it's the one that he was reviewing in the previous review. And I was like, why are we giving him money to do this when? And the other thing was, like, you don't read Korean books. Why should I care about what you say? You've never reviewed a Korean book. Why should I care about like your other reviews? And to be honest, I don't. But I'm constantly being told that I should. And that in itself, I think, is a huge problem. The other thing that I'm constantly thinking about is when I workshop a book, normally outside of a Korean workshop, a multilingual workshop, I workshop a book, and then people suggest like, oh, submit it to this publisher. The first thing I do is go to that publisher's website and count the number of Korean books that they published. And the second thing is count the number of Asian books that they published. And quite a lot of these publishers have never published a Korean book and have never published an Asian book even, which to me is mind-blowing because it's the biggest continent on the planet. It's the most populous continent on the planet. And there's such a diversity in that for you never to have Like, you don't have a South Asian book, you don't have a Southeast Asian book, like you don't have, you know, I mean, Japan kind of is always an outlier. So sometimes I don't count, like if they have one Japanese book, I'm like, oh, that doesn't count. Like, because of complicated reasons, like Japan is kind of like an outlier. But yeah, so this is something that I look at, and in the beginning of my career, especially, I would judge, and I would judge very harshly. And then I'd be like, well, I don't want to submit my book to your publisher because what's the point? You know, why should I, you know, seek the approval of this publisher that very clearly has some kind of bias? But then the other problem arises where now that I'm at a certain place in my career, if I don't start doing that, then, you know, who's going to do it? You know, do I ask the younger translators to do it? Do I ask, you know, someone who's like 25 years old and starting out like to do it? Like, that's so unfair to them. If I'm in a position that if I have just a tiny, even the tiniest bit of more leverage than my peers, then I kind of have to be the person to break into that list. And it becomes very important that, you know, that book also does very well. I mean, it's unfortunate, but you know, if the first Korean book that they do is a flop, then they're gonna be like, oh, this is another Korean book. Like, this is gonna be an issue. So I've tried to like step away from not doing and sort of take on some more responsibility, and it's going okay. But I just remember in the beginning of my career, like, you know, there are all these certain institutions that people kept telling me were so great and that, you know, I should kowtow to them and whatever. And I'd be like, I don't know, like, why, you know, I don't know. It was just so problematic for me. And there was a lot of, I remember starting out and I was like, oh, this is so much pressure to put on me. And like, why should I be the one to be a pioneer? It's just too much. But then I think, yeah, as you kind of move on, you do need to sort of maybe take on responsibility and think more about like what you can do. Not so much as like what you can't do, and there are many things that I can't do. But sometimes what you can do becomes, there's a point where what you can do becomes a little bit more interesting than what you can't do. And I think that's kind of where I have to start putting my focus on.
Thank you for that. I guess Tilted Axis is one of the organizations that I work with that publishes, at the moment, Asian literature, and we're looking at ways of expanding and moving away from nation-state language, I guess is what I'm trying to noodle my way to. And I guess I wonder if that is something that we can add to our advocacy efforts, because obviously if a publisher publishes a book from Korean and decides, oh, you know, this was a flop and now all Korean literature is a flop, it makes it difficult to sort of untangle the fact that every, you know, linguistic space is complex and varied, and you won't get the same thing. Like Bor Chung and Sang Young Park, to talk about two of your authors, are very different people and produce very different literature. And yeah, I guess I wonder how you, Madhu, or you, Frank, would feel about, we seem to have fallen into this place of like, you know, more Swedish, I mean, we don't need to advocate for Swedish literature, but, you know, more, you know, Central American literature and et cetera, and creating these sort of, maybe this homogeneity within these spaces. And there are certain languages that, you know, sit at the top of the language pyramid that you don't have to do this for so much. Like French doesn't, French books don't face quite the same expectations as like literature from Brazil, for example. But yeah, thoughts?
Well, in part they fall into a canon that the Anglophone world thinks it understands.
Yes.
But actually, so Granta are doing a Francophone edition for the first time ever. More than high time. It took 2 or 3 people, at least one of whom is here in the audience, to remind them that Francophone literature is not simply literature written in France. that Mauritian literature, the literatures of West Africa, of North Africa, of the Caribbean, all have hugely important writers who have been comprehensively ignored in English. Lionel Trouillot, who is probably the great living Haitian writer, has had like maybe 2 stories translated into English. Part of the problem, this thing of a Korean book didn't work, so that's Korean literature out the window, is this kind of bizarre fetishization of other countries as a single homogenous thing. And it fits also in with what my friend Ravi used to call the matter of. So the matter of Britain is, what gives us King Arthur and so on and so forth. But basically, Anglophone publishers want a book from Argentinian Spanish if it's about the Black Decade, if it's about the disappearances. You were born in Rwanda, good. Could you write about the genocide? Oh, you weren't born then. Well, were your parents born then? Did they die? We somehow want to conflate the history and culture of something, package it up neatly, translate it, then we'll never have to read another book like this again. And the flip side of that, which is almost as bad, is, during the Latin American boom, we decided that everything being written and published in Latin America was worth translating, and quite a lot of it wasn't. And quite a lot was going on during that period in other cultures, in other languages. I think the real problem is that most editors at British and American publishers are monolingual. They're also monolingual in their reading habits, in that they don't read much in translation. And so this is an adjunct to what they're doing. This is not true of many of the smaller presses that are around now, but mostly they get pitched by agents. They deal with what the agents send them first, the 3-way auction, 5-way auction, et cetera, and then they get round to, maybe I'll think about doing this. Has it won a prize elsewhere? How many languages has it already been translated into? Nobody, in the Netherlands, they've probably translated it before, they translate English books before they even get published in English. So there's part of it is a vast cultural problem, which neatly ties in with a wonderful essay that Anton wrote for Violent Phenomena, which is about the typical English reader. So a lot of these people as gatekeepers are saying, well, the typical English reader isn't going to care about this. Why would they? Stop speaking for, billions of people and what their experiences might be, when what you're really saying is, I don't know if I can get this past, sales and marketing.
I was just thinking when you were talking about all of the great British publishers that were founded by immigrants and then got, sucked into the blob, that at least in my experience of US publishing, very, very, very few editors are immigrants. It may be because becoming an immigrant via sort of with documentation is quite expensive, and most of these companies don't want to bear the expense of helping you get your green card. But almost like you might have, second or third generation editors like whose grandparents were immigrants or their parents were immigrants, but oftentimes that's not the case at all. So it's not just monolingual and monolingual reading habits, they're also, many of them born and bred in America. But anyway, moving, I don't remember my past question, but maybe you do.
So I think in terms of nations and thinking about certain kinds of ideas of culture that can get kind of flattened out and advocating for your language or for your culture, that is not my project. Or it's foisted on you, and then you take it on because of the conditions. In some ways, it's like what Anton said. You don't start out being like, I'm going to be the advocate for Korean literature, right? Like you like a particular book, and I think for me, I think not that interested in nations. I'm not a nationalist, not a cultural nationalist. And I think also the way that language is spread, right? Like if you think of a language like Arabic, what country are you talking about, And what Arabic are you talking about? I mean, every language is multiple languages. There is no French language, right? So I think thinking about those differences, I'm very, like, a really wonderful translator hero of mine is Mona Karim, who, you know, she gives a really interesting perspective because she is stateless from, you know, she's from a Badoon community, community from Kuwait, right? And what does it mean to be translating Arabic, you know, from that, from the perspective of being in the U.S., translating Octavia Butler into Arabic? I mean, really, like Audre Lorde into Arabic, right? Like, these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. Like these, I guess, I was thinking about, forgive me for badly paraphrasing, but I think like Robin Cowley, the scholar, says something about like kind of in response to, like, a response to fascism needs internationalism. And so to me, I feel like I'm interested in like solidarities. I'm interested in like ways in which people find each other across languages and across cultures through translation. And so I think, yeah, of course I love my language. I want more Telugu to be kind of in English, but it doesn't actually matter to me that much, which is, again, I know a weird thing to say, but if it's okay, I want to just mention something from outside of translation, which is I work for the Bard Prison Initiative, and I was talking one day with one of my colleagues who's a BPI alum, okay, and I just happened, you know, been working with him for a while, and I just happened to ask him, I said, like, what was your senior honors, like your senior project, your senior thesis about? And he started just reciting this poem by Robert Hayden, Runagate, Runagate, and just started kind of getting, you know, just recited, you know, the poem. And then we were talking, and he was talking about the fact that his senior project was about Richard Wright. But he made this through line that was really interesting to me about his work, my colleague's work. Actually, he was really interested in what is called like urban fiction, you know, sometimes called like ghetto fiction, right? These like, and he was talking about like this, thinking about Richard Wright, and then thinking about this line to like what's called like urban fiction, and what is this urban fiction trying to do? And is it, are there kinds of works that should not be in the canon, not because they don't like stand up to certain rigors, but because they want to do something else. You know, they are interested in something else. They want to circulate in other ways, right? And I'm thinking about that in terms of translation. Like, maybe it's like there's a resistance in that. Resistance to like, you know, like, so on the one hand, he's like studied Richard Wright and Robert Hayden, like some very kind of old school, like African-American writers. And then, but there's something about like, well, what's the, like, really interesting work sometimes is not captured, right? In like, certainly in the prizes and the book reviews and the recognition. And I think there is something about the life outside of that center that's really interesting to me. And I think in terms of translation, again, like these circuits, like, you know, I like everyone this morning who was talking, I love like some small presses. I think there's something about, and I'm saying this also because there's something about like those other modes I think is increasingly of interest to me in terms of like the life of language, the life of art and literature, because I think I'm not supposed to say this, so I'll say it. Last year when I was one of the jurors for the National Book Award, which is, it requires those titles to be published in the US, right? So literature in translation published by the US. Wonderful books were submitted. Heaps and heaps of Latin American literature were submitted. Chile, Czech, Argentina, Czech, Mexico, Czech, Central America, nope. Caribbean, nope, right? So even within one language, there are, you know, lots of variations. Not one single book was submitted to us from all of South Asia, from Southeast Asia, and there was one book submitted from Africa that was written in German by someone I think living in Germany. And we're all patting ourselves on the back, celebrating like translated literature, right? And I'm like, this is not cool, you know? And so on the one hand, there's the work to be done resisting on that front, advocating. And on the other hand, there's also something else, which is like just go underground, look for the other interesting things happening. Don't try to convert it all into like, try to get Random House to publish, some book from, a vernacular language in India. They're not going to do it because they have the easy out, especially in a lot of South Asia, they have the easy out to say, well, English. People write in English in India. Yes, like 0.03% of people like read books in English in India. Mm-hmm. Great.
And I mean, one of the, all prizes by definition are artificial, and they all make up artificial rules. So for the International Booker, books have to have been published in the United Kingdom. And both the author and the translator need to be alive at the point at which they were submitted. You're free to die afterwards. You can still win. But the whole thing of you need to be published in Britain has led some publishers to open editorial offices in London that are, I was going to say a phone. Does anyone use phones anymore? I don't know, an Ethernet connection or something like that, and somebody who's supposedly a commissioning editor. And others like Seagull, who already publish from Bengali, from Telugu, from Malayalam, from etc. None of their books will be considered. They do have an office in London, but it has been decided that that office does not really constitute an editorial office. And they said, well, we have to have these rules. And I said, well, that's all very well, but the problem is, the only way Seagull could have that kind of editorial office in London is if they've already won the International Booker several years in a row. It's one of the many things I wanted to talk about in my tenure at the Booker, which didn't get talked about, was the shocking relationship that Britain has with Indian and Pakistani languages. Because it's not as though these things are not being translated. They're being published by Penguin India, they're being published by OUP in India. The translations already exist, but they so don't care that even when they are in English, they won't publish them. I mean, years and years ago, when Chaurungi was shortlisted for, actually it might have won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. Great. It had to have been published in the last year, and it had been published in the last year in the UK, having previously been published 12 years earlier in India in English. That's the length of time that and that I don't know how you get around, but I do think, and I would campaign strongly that actually, if we're going to say this is for something translated into English, can we at least not insist on what postcode it was published? Because that allows smaller publishers from other languages who are never going to have an office here and are never going to have an office in Dublin or London or whatever, to at least have their books considered.
I always wonder if that has to do with the fear of opening up prizes. When they opened up the Man Booker to the US, there were all of these op-eds being like, oh no, the Americans are going to overwhelm our lists and take all the prizes.
Well, yeah, and that was part of what they feared. I mean, actually, American editors weren't keen on it either, because American editors used to use the English language Booker as a way to know what the hell was going on and what they wanted to buy. And they also figured that Americans didn't need it. But I mean, prior to that, of course, American authors were part of the International Booker Prize. And while they were part of the International Booker Prize, only 2 writers in translation ever won. Everyone else was American or Canadian.
I do think that we have to talk a little bit about advocating for literary translators and not just for literary translation. I've loved the different threads. I think when I was talking about advocating for language, I didn't necessarily mean your language, but as a sort of like something a little bit more borderless and maybe more expansive. But there's so many machinations in the way publishing works. There are insane things that you see in contracts, for example, that actually impede the publication of a book somewhere else. And as we were talking about I can't remember how you put it, Frank, but essentially printing versus publishing. Privishing versus publishing. There are things in contracts that prevent that. There are publishers that will take all of the rights and then not let go of them, even if someone is begging to publish it in another place, which is, essentially preventing an entire readership from accessing this book. And it's kind of crazy to me, now that I do more rights work with Tilted Access, if you don't time things very correctly when you're submitting a book, like Tomb of Sand, for example, I sent out with a sample to several publishers. We did not get an offer until it was shortlisted for the Booker International. I sent it back to people who had turned it down when it was shortlisted, and then they said no again without even reading the entire manuscript. And then when she won the prize, these same publishers, these editors who turned it down twice, were like, are the rights still available? It's like, no. But another thing I've encountered when submitting books is that, the university presses, for example, if they cannot take world rights, they will not be interested in buying rights to your book. And so I'm working for UK press, trying to make sure that this book reaches the US, but I keep, finding these coming up against these strange corporate walls. But anyway, I was going to talk about literary translators, not publishing. I guess, we are all humans, we are all workers. When we talk about literary translation, my perspective is that we're often talking about a labor issue as well. And they feel inextricable to me because if you have for example, the compensation to work on a book for 6 months instead of 3 months, the quality of your work is obviously going to be affected. And I guess I just wonder where your focuses are. You, Frank, said that you would never translate a book if they take your copyright, for example. I know we all, or maybe not where your focuses are, but where you think we should be pushing toward what is working now that wasn't working before. Where do we still need to?
Well, in part, my reluctance to sign a contract where I'm ceding copyright, the license of copyright in most contracts allows them to publish it forever and ever as long as it doesn't go out of print. I have no problem with that, as long as there's a reversion clause, as long as whatever. But for them to hold copyright, let's say it then goes out of print, I can't take it anywhere else. I can't take my translation anywhere else, even though the underlying rights would need to be acquired elsewhere. It just seems such a pointless thing for them to want to have. It's not a useful asset. So it's just one of those things where you kind of think, no, don't be silly. Why do you want this? You don't need it and it's not useful to you. No, when you're saying, obviously, how do you manage to spend, 6 months working on a book rather than 3? And the answer to that is you don't. The only way you can do that is by varying the sorts of things that you translate, because I am paid, pretty much I'm paid exactly what everybody else working in translation is. I get the same per 1,000 rate as anyone, which means that I have to translate somewhere between 4 and 5 books a year in order to make a basic living. That's non-negotiable. And of course, once you've actually got that kind of thing up and running, you've also got the ones that are behind you. So you have the proofs coming back and the edits coming back and so on and so forth kind of thing. It would be great if translation were paid for the labor that is involved, but that is simply not how things have been done historically. And I don't know how easily it would be to shift that, to say, actually, this may be a short book, but it's an incredibly dense, incredibly complex book, and it's going to take me forever. Whereas, yes, I realize this is 700 pages, but it zips along and I get it. I don't know how you shift that, and the only way I can do it is by varying the sorts of things that I do, some of which are faster and some of which are a lot slower.
Anton?
I'm just remembering. I've forgotten the question, but what Frank was saying, sorry. But what Frank was saying, I just remembering. I'm just going to say the names because, why not? So Harvard University has this Korean literature and translation magazine, and they were trying to commission a translation from me, and I was reading the contract, and it said that I have to give up like 35 years of copyright of my translation to them, and they have first right of refusal to renew it after 35 years for another 35 years. So that's 70 years, which is the lifetime of a copyright, I guess. And I remember looking at that, and then they also said something like, if you ever publish this somewhere else or like in a book, then you have to credit Harvard. And it said that it's specifically the copyright is owned by Harvard Corporation, I believe. And I remember looking at that, and I was like, and then I emailed them back saying, now, mind you, this is an author that I got that was never translated before I translated him, and he got Booker nominated on his first book in translation. And so I'm quite tied to this author. And I said, and I wrote back to that magazine, and I said, this is slightly ridiculous. I can license you the copyright, but I can't give it to you because this is part of a composite novel, and I would like to translate the entire book someday, and I don't want to be beholden to you to give me the right to translate, to publish this book because you own part of the book. Do you see how ridiculous this is? I said it much more politely than that. But. And then they emailed me back saying, oh, then, this is just our policy. So, basically F off and die, whatever. So I was like, okay. But surely the rights holder for that story, which is the Korean publisher, would never agree to a contract like this, but apparently they did. I don't know what the head contract looks like. I suspect that it's very different from the translation. But for them to so casually ask for the copyright for 70 years for my translation like that, and that I would have for the next 70 years, I have to ask Harvard University, for which I have no ties to. I didn't go to college in America even. Like to ask them for the right to publish my work, and for them to have that as their default, because this magazine has been in publication for a while. So did they ask that for like every single one of their other translators? That's absurd. And then what they did was they hired a translator who debuted later than me and is younger than me. In other words, has less leverage than I do. And they had him do it. So I happened to know this translator, so I messaged him so what happened with the copyright? And I guess I'm not allowed to say what happened, but because that's his story. But it was so, I was just so incensed. And so this other translator has translated my author, and now that publication is out, and I don't know if I will be able to bring that book that story is part of into publication. Do I have to thank Harvard even if I become the translator of that book? Because if he becomes the translator of that book, if he takes my author away from me, which is a whole other thing, if he takes my author away from me, then he definitely has to thank Harvard for their largesse and letting him use their copyright. It's just the fact that they asked this so casually, and apparently they asked this to, they must have asked it to other people. I can't verify this. It was just so absurd to me, and it just made me so angry. And I could say no, because I have other authors and I have whatever, but to demand that from young translators who are up and coming, I don't know. It's just I just wanted to call them out in this public forum.
There are no more insidious words in publishing than it's standard practice, which means it's standard practice until it ceases to be. I'm going to tell a very quick story and then I'll shut up. So I translated a book many, many years ago. It is the reason that I could then go on to become a translator. I don't need to name it, you'll work it out. It won a prize. It is the only French novel to have sold more than 1 million copies in paperback in the United Kingdom since Camus died and probably before. None of this is down to me. This is all down to controversy, yada, yada, yada. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I'd signed a contract. That was all fine. They came back to me and they sent me a a codicil to my contract, which is an addendum to a contract that already exists. This would give them ebook rights in the novel. And I said, and they said, we'll give you 1% of net receipts. I said, no. I think you've made a slight mistake here. I get, 1% of cover price on the actual ones, and that's equivalent to about 4 or 5% of net receipts, and that's what I get as standard from other publishers. Yeah, no. It's just policy. It's just like that, And I went, well, okay, well, I might take 2.5 and I might take 3, but I'm not taking 1. They went, yeah, I'm afraid we can't make an exception. And I said, well, actually, in that case, I can't make an exception either. So you'll just have to not do the ebook. And they said, well, actually, the underlying rights were already in the contract. They were implicit. I said, well, actually, they weren't implicit. And I know they definitely weren't implicit because you sent me an email chain that also copies in the fact that you're asking Flammarion for ebook rights from them. So if you didn't implicitly have the French ebook rights, then you can't possibly have had my ebook rights. And they went, oh, okay. Let's not talk about this for a while. So we didn't talk about this for a while. And then I discovered that the people to whom they had sub-licensed my translation in the United States, Knopf, had put out an ebook edition. And so I casually wrote to them and I said, so Knopf have got this ebook edition out there. Now, far be it from me to phone them up and tell them that they cannot have sub-licensed from you rights that you do not have because you have agreed with me that you don't have any ebook rights. So I could send a cease and desist letter to Knopf, or we could resolve this. And roundabout then the whole, that's just how it works, became, well, okay, on this occasion, I said, actually, I've got all these other books with Random House, can we, but it's one of those, people will always send you a boilerplate. People will always say, we want all of these rights. People will always say, if they've been, in your case, if the Harvard Review or anybody else wanted something from an English language book, you get first serial. It doesn't even give them second serial. It certainly doesn't give them the right, but again, it's like you get what you can get and you hold on to it like grim death.
I think that's the thing that we're always working against is like whatever is the status quo. This is how it is, and it's like, and it's amazing because on the one hand, like I'm so grateful I don't work in publishing. I don't have to deal with all of those very specific demands, but also it's just like you're in the realm of like working with people who work with imagination, and sometimes there's just not a whole lot of imagination in terms of how to think about books or literature. And I think the thing I want to say as kind of like on the margins of profession, because when we're talking about, there's practical matters and then there's like professionalization, right? Like what it means to be a professional translator. And there's 2 pieces of that I'm interested in, because I don't make a living as a translator. I mean, it would be silly if I tried. But one thing I'm interested in is like how other people have translated who are not, who are writers or like do other things, and translation is part of their practice. And I'm really interested in like that, how people make that work in terms of a life, a living, and where that kind of practice feeds into other kinds of practices. Someone who I'm really interested in kind of like learning more about his translation is the Black American gay writer Melvin Dixon, who translated Senghor, the Negritude poet. And I'm like just kind of thinking about going back and looking at who, like, there are a lot of books I read when I was younger when I didn't know, like, who's the translator, right? And to kind of go back and look at the books you read as like a teenager or a young adult and be like, oh, like, who was that person? And if they were not a professional translator, like, meaning they were a professional, but if that wasn't their primary identity, what else were they doing? There's all these like questions for me around that. How do people make it work, right? And also, on the other end of the spectrum, I'm interested in advocacy for translators in terms of who gets to do it in the first place. Because I think, this has just been like a main, for me, like through line of my work is like, there are so many people in the US who have some partial fractured access to a language, and their fractured access has to do with like either being immigrant or just, just different forms of historical disruption, right? Like, this is definitely the case with indigenous communities where there's a partial access to a language, because, again, like there's can be like all sorts of historical violence involved with this. But of course, like there are tons of people who are writers and smart and interesting thinkers who have some access to Spanish because maybe they speak it partially at home or something. But why are they not encouraged to do literary translation? And what are the access points for that kind of work? Like, how do we bring more people into the fold to do this work? And one of the thoughts I have, it's not a popular thought, but this is coming off of like what I said about the National Book Awards, because what happens is publishers throw up their hands. Well, what can we do? Like those people aren't coming to us with like they're not pitching translations, right? Or like everyone's like, what can we do? What can we do? And I don't think it's up to anyone to solve the problem, but I think it is up to everyone to figure out what they can do, and not to sit with the status quo, right? And so, like one of my suggestions, I know it's like this is like dead on arrival, but like what if for like 5 years? It's a very, very, very small amount of time. It's not enough time. But what if for 5 years, all emerging grants to support, like there are all these grants where you can like work on getting a startup on a translation project, right? What if all grants were given to like, let's say like underrepresented languages, or like and you say, okay, we're not doing any. No one is getting a emerging translators grant who's doing like a French writer, unless it's like a Haitian writer, or like someone from Cote d'Ivoire or something like that. And even then, like maybe that's like a separate category. But like like just creating entry points, like giving people an on-ramp to do this work, I think is critical. And as long as everyone's saying, well, they're just not there, then it doesn't move forward, because also translation is also often sponsored by things like Alliance Française, right? Like which cultures, languages have the capacity to make grants and support the work in the first place? And what do you do about those languages and cultures where that money isn't there? Who's going to step in?
I would love for more opportunities to be created. I think right now we have there are 3 grants that translators can access. Some of them are publishers. There's a English Pen grant for publishers. There's the NEA for translators here, but it's only open. Is it only open to green card holders and U.S. citizens?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the pen
And that's for publishers.
the pen grants are both for publishers. One is for marketing, the other is for translation
And
costs.
then there's the Penheim.
And the Penheim is here,
Yeah.
but not there.
But it's open to anyone.
Penheim is open to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is Translators Allowed are now doing a 1-year bursary for an emerging translator, either from an underrepresented language or from an underrepresented community. I think actually, and across the board, all grants for a period of 5 years should go to, and would be a brilliant idea, because actually you're quite right. The cultures that can prop up their own literatures do. I mean, so twice a year, once before the London Book Fair, once before Frankfurt, German books in, there's a piece done by German Books in Print of books that are available for translation that they want to highlight, etc. Every single one of those books will have their entire translation paid if someone buys the underlying rights to it. Aside from the Institut Français, there is also the CNL. There are a bunch of French and Spanish and whatever. Koreans actually are pretty good about doing it. It depends on. But I mean, you can be pretty sure that Telugu is not one of those where that happens, or Bengali, or Bahasa, or But also, if what we want is to have L2 and other people come into translation, it's difficult enough to get into it in any way, shape, or form. Making a living is an entirely separate thing, but even getting into it in the first place, because actually most editors go with translators that they already know or translators they have already heard of because it's easy. Not because they necessarily think in advance, this is the ideal translator for this thing. They just think, well, it's easy, you know. I mean, the reason I could be a translator was not because Welbeck had been successful, therefore everyone knew who I was. They didn't. But if they bought a French book, they'd just think, why don't we get whoever it was who did, you know, the Welbeck thing. That was it, you know. It was a calling card, but not because they knew who I was. They knew what that book was, and therefore, fine, let's go with that. And I do think there needs to be some sort of structure that helps or encourages translators in, because actually, you know, even when I started, translation was a hobby. And I don't mean I took it on as a hobby, but I mean that's how it was treated. And that's how it was treated by publishers. Nobody worried about, you know, how you were going to pay the rent or whatever. Nobody, you know, it wasn't in that sense a profession. If you wanted to make money out of it, or if you wanted to try and make it into your job, then that was up to you to do it. Nobody introduced you to other editors or other publishers, or and you know, you could pitch books. But I mean, I spent 12 years pitching Modiano to be told, yeah, you know, the average English reader isn't all that interested. He's a bit small, he's a bit French. And then one October morning, I got 12 phone calls saying, remember that Modiano person? Which ones were we supposed to buy again? But, you know, so yeah, I mean, the trouble is that world literature is kind of an afterthought in the climate that we're in a way that it wasn't, say, at the beginning of the 20th century, and it wasn't in the middle of the 20th century. We take for granted that the sort of most of the major, certainly European writers, and to some extent Latin American writers, were translated as standard, more or less, as they were publishing throughout the first half of the 20th century. Doesn't happen now. And certainly if you look beyond a handful of European or colonial languages, it certainly doesn't.
I had this very bizarre meeting once with the producers. What's the production company that Brad Pitt started? Plan B. Mm-hmm. Some, like, their literary division wanted to talk to Tilted Access after 3 of our books were longlisted for the International Booker. And it was interesting. I found it completely baffling because, one, I didn't know what they wanted. I don't think they knew what they wanted. And I was like, what we need is money. Like, you need to, you know, we need a pot of money so that we can pay for more underrepresented literatures to be translated by people who are not already represented in the profession. And it's annoying that it often comes back to that, but it's part of me, like, people get NEA grants. A lot of academics get NEA grants or Penheim grants to translate a book that they then never actually try to pitch. So then it just becomes this, you know, they got this money, but the book never actually reached people because they didn't know what to do with it. I think we've gone on quite a long time, but I wanted to quickly say that I think, for example, this is a fruitful way to sort of continue pushing the advocacy that we're going to have to continue doing until the hegemony of English collapses, probably, because other places translate much more than we do into English. But also that I find that advocating for yourself is a really good way of advocating for literary translators in general. So if you draw lines and tell people that you're drawing these lines, then, I don't know, sometimes, you know, professionally
in terms of one of the very minor things that as a translator you can do, I mean, on a publisher with an author who I translated before and very much cared about, where I said, I am not doing this, and they said, but, I said, look, I can afford to take the hit on this. I don't really care what you're paying me. It doesn't really matter. But what I don't want is you just come to me and said, oh, well, this person, who are, you know, big translators, are prepared to accept our terms. I do not want you using my name next time you go out and try and do a bad deal with somebody else. because I can afford for you not to. So I'm not going to do it. The small thing that everyone can do is every bookshop you go past, you go in and find every translated book by anyone you know, and you put it on the tables and you rank them all face out. I've been doing this for years, I swear. It's just one of those things that I do, and people just pick them up and go. And certainly within physical bookshops, that's how you browse. You pick things up and wow, this is interesting. Maybe I'll buy this.
You can also go talk to booksellers and say, this book is really great, you should carry it. I mean, we have 4 translators here who also do other things. You're an educator, you've both judged prizes. Anton, you seem to do a million things that I can't keep
He's
track
writing
of.
a book.
Writing a book. I do foreign
may
rights
have
as
written.
well. I had a previous life as a bookseller. There's a whole ecosystem of people who actually advocate for literary translators, though they don't always, some people could do better. We're not going to name names today, but we just saw 2 panels where, critics.
We will be naming names. They'll be subtitled in the YouTube version of this.
Well, when I was working, more full-time in publishing at an agency, I realized that a lot of our currency was gossip. And I was talking to a friend about how we gossip so much. And she, who'd had gone through academia for a while, mentioned this academic whose name I've clearly forgotten, who said that gossip was a weapon used by minorities and oppressed people to actually share information and create networks of power. And so if you take anything from this, translators is gossip. Publishers, I think, if they don't know this yet, should know that we all talk to each other.
It's one of the funniest things is when they come to you and they say, you were our first thought, when this author came up, and you're going, really? Okay, so these 6 people who told me that they turned it down are all lying.
Oh, another thing, standard policy is oftentimes a lie.
Oh,
there
God, yes.
are always precedents that they're unwilling to tell you about. Please don't use this against me at Tilted Access. But yeah, I feel like we should probably open it up to questions. I feel like
Or comments, or if you have some fruit you want to throw.
Questions disguised as remarks disguised as questions. I think it's for the recording.
No, it's okay. We got one here.
Hi, thank you. This has been very interesting so far. Speaking about advocacy, those of us who are producing translations could use a hand with information about who does publish translations. So it's hard to find that kind of information in one place. You pick it up here and there, and a footnote here, an author note there. But is there a source that has a comprehensive list of publishers who are interested in translation?
I believe there are a few lists around.
Okay.
There are a couple.
So
I'll certainly look one up. I mean, Whether That Borders has one. There are 2 or 3 that will say, I mean, they're mostly going to list the independent and small presses, because within larger publishers, you need to know the individual editors at individual imprints. To say if Farrar Straus are interested in translation, well, some of the editors there are, some of the editors there aren't. So without knowing, it's not enough.
There's a Google spreadsheet that's being circulated and that's available online. I don't think I have the link for it, but I have seen it circulated many times. So if you look for it, it exists. Also, if you happen to have a sample for your book and if you're looking for a specific publisher, for me, the surest thing is to show it to other translators. And then they'll kind of take a look at it and be like, oh, this sounds like such and such's book. And so for me, so Alta, they have a workshop that they do. And and also there are other workshops, there's so many translator collectives now, and they also have workshops, and there are pitch sessions, and you can kind of show it to other publishers, translators who are kind of like a little, or who seem to be a bit more plugged into the ecosystem, and they can kind of tell you like, oh, like I got rejected from this publisher, but I think they'll like your manuscript because of such and such thing.
There's a 3% database as well, where you can
Sorry.
the 3% has a database.
3%.
Yeah,
3%.
that was started by Chad Post, and I think it's now housed in like Publishers Weekly.
Yeah.
And you can search by language and year, which can be helpful.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to say I have a background in librarianship, and the policy for collecting books at a large federal library in this city, the Library of Congress, the policy is not to add translations to the collections, because the thought behind that is that the work in its original language is what needs to be added to the collection. So it's usually a secondary choice to bring a translation in if the original is not available, or if someone has asked for a translation, that's the time. So in a way, it's like a secondary consideration in it's called the canons of selection. Anyway, that's a
Well,
kind of
that's screwed up.
a disappointing,
Well,
it's
thanks for
a
telling
little
us
bit
that.
disappointing. You know?
Yeah.
Just behind there.
Hi, thank you. I hope this isn't too much into the more nitty-gritty of translation as far as a question, but in the first panel, they talked about a translator having trust from readership, from publishers, and as someone who's a new translator and does not have that, one thing that I sometimes wrestle with is, say you have a work that's fairly experimental, you have something where they're doing weird stuff with their syntax and it's really intentional and the author's destabilizing the sentence, and as a new translator, it can feel like, okay, is someone just going to say this is a really bad translation? So what can someone do, or what needs to happen in the community so that there is more freedom, or not, for me not to have the sense, or a new translator not to have the sense, okay, I need to kind of flatten this out, or everyone's going to reject it, or they're going to just think what is this person doing? I don't know, I'd just be interested to hear you speak to some of that, as far as when you have a text that's doing something weird and you think it's great, but it could also, because there isn't as much of, in publishing, not the recognition of translated literature, it could just be like, oh, this person didn't know how to translate.
Anton, do you want to take this?
I mean, so I'm kind of known for not being so faithful. I feel like I'm very faithful, but apparently I'm not. So I was very lucky enough to kind of almost get started at the British Center for Literary Translation. And they have a summer school that's like, it's the summer school for literary translation and creative writing. So they emphasize the creative writing aspect of it. And they have all of these, they had these classes, creative writing classes alongside the translation classes, where they kind of make you let go. And by the time I was done with the first time that I went through, I was like, oh, I can do more than what I thought was translation. I had a very conservative view of translation. Frankly, I still think I do, but I'm told I'm not. But so that was very liberating for me. So I do understand like what you're going through, like what the pressures. They absolutely exist, especially if you are an emerging translator. I just want to tell you that your feelings and like your fears are completely, like, I completely understand it. That's exactly how I felt. I kind of overcame that because I had that encouragement from the outside. Like, there's only so much you can do as one person. Translation is a fundamentally collaborative endeavor. Even if you never show anyone your translation, you're still, and even if your author is dead, you're still collaborating with the author's text. So it is so fundamentally an act of collaboration, and also so is publishing is also very collaborative, and that's kind of like what you have to tap into. And I feel like a lot of editors as well now. They've been very kind. The editors that I've worked with, certainly, they've been wonderful, and they've just been very encouraging me to not be so afraid of foreignization, and to, you can be creative. And also, this is something that I always tell emerging translators. Like, the first time you're being edited for a book, or anything, like Words Without Borders, let's say, it's very scary, and it feels like I have to do everything that the editor tells me to. Because a lot of emerging translators, a lot of translators are very good students, are very good at taking direction, because the ability to speak more than one language, it takes a lot of learning and it takes a lot of discipline. And so we're so used to doing what other people tell us that we get very very scared when an editor says something. Oh, shouldn't it be this? Then it immediately sounds like it feels like a imperative. But the great majority of editors that I've dealt with, for them, it's the opening of a dialogue, and they want to have a dialogue with the translator. And sometimes they're just making sure, oh, this is not how I would do it, but so let me just do it like this, and see how you feel. So if you feel like that correction is whatever, then you can always set it. But always remember that it's a dialogue. You're supposed to push back. You're supposed to be like, oh, I did this intentionally, so you can't change this part. And other times you'll be like, for me, 99% of the time, it's like, oh yeah, that is stupid, I will change it. But there's always that 1 or 2% for me where I'm like, oh, this is the intended subtext, so we can't change this, we can't change this. And I recently had a very bad copy editing experience. The copy editor, not the editor. The editor's wonderful, but the copy editor was very zealous, and they changed the entire name of a character, and it was very dramatic. So I was like, I can't advocate for the author if I let this translation through the way that it is. So it was a nightmare, but I think I've lived through it. But yeah, so don't be afraid to push back. That's kind of the advice that I want to give you, and try to seek help from the outside, because sometimes you will need that encouragement. And also, I know it's very scary, and I know that it feels like, oh, if I translate this, who's going to read it? B, if I translate it this way, who's going to understand it? But that was the case for so many of the work that I initially started to, I chose to translate, Bora Chung's Cursed Bunny. It was not a bestseller in Korea. No one in Korea had really read it. And it's such a weird story. It's not, Hwang Seok-young, it's not a conventional Korean narrative that has been published in English. But for me, to me, I just got so bloody-minded. I was so clear that this is going to be whatever. This is going to be what it became. That it would be a very compelling work of English. That every little thing that I did in it, where there might be a microscopic moment where I'd be like, oh, is someone going to get it? But I would just convince myself that no, someone is going to get it. Someone is going to get it. And then I would do it. So there's also a little bit of that you have to do. It's a self-hypnosis that you have to do. But yeah, if you believe in your work, then other people will believe in it too. That translates. That is what translates. And so I think having faith in your own ability, I think that goes a long way.
Very briefly, if you're pitching the work to an editor you don't know, then you're going to have to give them quite a lot of context. You're going to have to say, this is an experimental novel, it takes this sort of form, and it uses language that is not this, that, and the other. If they are then prepared to take it on board, either on your say-so or because they get another reader's report, then you begin the second part of the work. And the second part of the work, as Anton has just said, is your friend in all of this is Stet. My earliest translations were with an editor who made it very clear to me that all editing is done in the spirit of suggestion. It is not, you should do this. It is not, I think it would be better if. Frequently it's, I'm not entirely sure, or I'm not, and frequently, and you can say, actually, it's very ambiguous in the original. I'd like to keep that ambiguity if you don't mind, et cetera, et cetera. There's another thing. There are editors in the world, none of them in this room, possibly even in this city, who are just assholes. I had a translation sent back to me last year. This was a second edit. The translation had already been edited in the UK, but it was being re-edited in the US. Not Americanized, re-edited. The first comment in Track Changes said, I don't even need to look at the French to know I wouldn't translate this like this. So my original note in the margin, which was about 1,500 words, said, perhaps you took a fucking look at the French, we might get somewhere. But I then deleted that note and said, actually, the suggestions that you've made, interesting though they are, do not in any way encapsulate the tone. So sometimes you need to teach editors to suck eggs. I don't know why sucking eggs is an important thing, but sometimes you just, and that won't change. That's about individual relationships with individual editors. And there are extraordinary editors out there who will nurture you, and great copy editors who will save you from, horrendous fates. But there are always people, and they generally did some language relating to yours in high school, possibly got a, little, or maybe spent some time there. And so, yeah. Oh, authors can do that to you too, particularly because you're going to be translating into English, and they've almost certainly got a child or a cousin or somebody who was once in an English-speaking country. So they will say, why did you say structure rather than hierarchy? Well, it's not as though hierarchy did come to mind, but actually in this context.
And I will just add maybe just a briefer version, which is just to say, because I think just in terms of time, I see their readiness to head up, but do it wrong, do it strong.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, and as I've said to, precisely that. There is no right translation, therefore, at least be wrong creatively.